Good afternoon and welcome back to our fall semester book conversation. Today we have a treasured book conversation of a book that I am really constantly looking at and continuously trying to see where to fit in for my next spring semester on deconstructing Islamophobia and otherness. But more importantly, the book is coming from a dear friend, colleague, a co-participant in all of the work that we have been doing on Islamophobia at UC Berkeley. Also, a co-founder of the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association, something that is really launching the groundwork for a global Islamophobia uh, academic as well as research. And just last week, really a groundbreaking report on the Islamophobia industry in Canada, mapping the industry in a very rich report that I know is already being shared and being used, and hopefully is going to be one to build upon. So I'd like to welcome to our conversation Jasmin Zine, professor of sociology and Muslim studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. She has been written numerous articles, numerous books. Definitely her books, Canadian Islamic Schools, Unraveling Politics, Faith, Gender, Knowledge, and Identity, is still a must cite and a must use, as well as others. So I'm going to speak about this book that I'm having in my hand. And so, welcome, Jasmin. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great. So, I always begin with book title. So, how did we arrive at the book title? Also, the cover, and maybe what were other alternatives? Because usually that takes some time to craft the title, and it's usually point to something substantial. So, how did we get to this?
Well, thanks for that opening introduction and also this question, which really just gets to the heart of what this book is about in examining, the realities and lived experience of the 9/11 generation of Muslim youth who grew up at a time and came of age at a time where, the global war on terror was happening and domestic security policies were rendering them as suspect citizens, as folk devils, and around which moral panics were being constructed. And so there was something unique, in that title of looking at specifically the 9/11 generation as this, generation of millennial youth growing up within all of these very fraught conditions, which caused me to think about and articulate that experience as one of being under siege. And, the term had been used by some of the participants in my study. And I thought it made a appropriate title because it kind of captured that experience, encapsulated it in this idea of, feeling that your identity, your faith, your citizenship, your position in society was being constantly challenged on multiple fronts, whether it was political, ideological, and also in terms of your daily life, whether through microaggressions or through different forms of discrimination, that sort of everywhere you turn, there's a sense that your identity is being brought into question and being seen as suspect, as a potential radical or terrorist and all of that sort of thing. And so really the book is about that experience of growing up with all of these very fraught conditions that were ushered in the post 9/11 context. So that's how I think the title came into being, because so much of the book is animated by the narratives of the participants in my study that, that title also kind of came from that as well. And, the book cover was actually a photograph of a mosque in Toronto that had been vandalized. And so,
And I see the shattered glass right there.
exactly. So I think that also was a visual image that also kind of encapsulated some of what is described in the pages of the book.
And I also wanted to see that your dedication page is both to Osama and Yusuf, both of your sons.
Mhm.
And you said that really they face growing, they face experiences growing up with Islamophobia or others. And your conversation, most likely with them, have contributed to. So I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the dedication and how they fit into the book as well as the period that you're studying. It's like it's a personal almost engagement with the research.
It really is. For those of us who are Muslim and who are working in Islamophobia studies, it isn't just an intellectual exercise or just an academic field of study that we are somehow removed from. We have
Mhm.
skin in the game. And so we are, writing ourselves. I mean, ethnography, which is, what I use to do this study, is kind of storytelling, but our own stories come into that process as well. So for me, one of the things that inspired me to write this book was watching my sons grow up as part of this 9/11 generation. And, I still remember when, right after 9/11, when the Twin Towers were falling, and I was watching this on TV, and both of my sons, who were around, I think, 9 and 13 at the time, so still young, were at an Islamic school. And I
Mhm.
was immediately concerned that, even before we knew who was responsible, that the backlash would hit our community, because we were all, anything would go on somewhere in the world, there was an attack. Before anyone knew who was responsible, mosques, Islamic schools were getting bomb threats, had to evacuate and go to public schools, take the kids out. So we were, I was quite concerned. And, when we went to get our kids from the school, there was already, a group of men surrounding the school with their arms linked, as a kind of
Mhm.
security perimeter. So that really set the tone for what was going to follow. And as my sons were growing up, my older son is named Osama. So,
Mhm.
by the time Osama bin Laden became an infamous kind of name and a kind of derogatory name, he had to deal with that sort of labeling. And, as my sons were growing up, my younger son, Yusuf, was an actor. And after a
Mhm.
while, he was always getting typecast as, terrorist number two, and getting
Mhm.
those asked to read for those particular kinds of roles and things. And so I started to see how, the context they were growing up in was starting to shape their identities, their life choices, and how they navigated the world. And so I wanted to look deeper into how it
Mhm.
affected, other Muslim youth as well. But
Uh,
they were the starting point.
on the question of name Osama,
Mm.
I don't know. Did you have any conversation about should we change your name? Should we use a stand? Because I know that in many places Mo, Sam were being used. Was that part of the conversation? Did that come into at any time?
We never did. We always called him Osama, but I have to say, I mean, in the aftermath of 9/11, I was very reticent to call out his name publicly. If he
Yes.
was, running somewhere and I needed to get his attention, it was, people would look or stare. But at that time, he never changed his name, and we never suggested that he should or shorten his name. Sam is not a nickname we've ever used for him.
Yeah.
But I think over time, as he got older, he did use it selectively when he wanted to, cast attention away from his identity and the negative associations that got
Mhm.
attached to that name. I think strategically, as he got older, he did that from time to time.
Yeah. Now, for me, the key about your book is again, it's an ethnographic work. It's qualitative. That much of Islamophobia work, as possibly in terms of our engagement, is deciphering what the Islamophobes are saying,
Yeah.
rather than looking at Muslims' experiences.
Hmm.
So I really thank you that you actually have taken the narrative of Muslim voices and actually put it in this book. So if you want to talk about were you deliberate in that process? Is that a conscious effort of shifting the conversation in the research to that segment that really was not the subject of Islamophobia research?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, I've been doing ethnography for a very long time. And even prior to 9/11, I was
Mhm.
researching Muslim youth experiences.
Yeah.
And, they were talking about Islamophobia at that time as well. I mean, obviously, Islamophobia didn't start just after 9/11. It has a long history and genealogy, and we knew it in many forms before we maybe identified it with that particular name. But I was hearing about this for a long time. And so I was always interested in ethnography
Mhm.
as a methodology to, ground our understanding of Islamophobia and its complexities in the lived experience of Muslims. And so it was really a natural kind of progression for me to want to continue that ethnographic analysis. And, I think it allows us to, as you say, kind of flip the perspective. So we're not just
Mhm.
looking at what Islamophobia purveyors are saying, but we're
Mhm.
actually, looking at the lived experience and the
Mhm.
impact of Islamophobia on vulnerable populations, and allowing an opportunity to center those marginalized voices so that they can be interlocutors in their own experience. That, I even had a process of sort of collaborative theorizing. I talked to 130 youth across Canada
Mhm.
from coast to coast. And I went back to a subgroup of them as I was starting to come up with ideas and themes and theorizing, because as ethnographers, we are trying to extract theory from data and come up with some ideas of what's going on the ground. And I would go back to them and run these ideas by those youth so that they became collaborators in a kind of collaborative theorizing process. And it was important that their voices were centered, and they're often excluded from conversations about them. There's a lot said about them, but they're not, part of that conversation. And so, yeah, that methodology was, I think, important to be able to start to look at Islamophobia as, as a lived experience and not just as a phenomenon outside of that.
Yeah. So from the 130, whether interviews or collaborators that you had, how many of those you really reduce them for your in-depth study, if I may
Well, I
ask?
tried to include as many narratives as possible to show the diversity. I think I had about 26 ethno-racial groups represented in the sample. There's about an even number of those who identify as male and female within the study. There were some Sunni and Shia represented. So I really wanted to be able to show that cross section in the narratives that I chose. Of course, it's hard, you can't get all 130 voices in there. So a lot of it is also, just kind of combined in sort of what were common themes among the youth that I interviewed. But, some of the key interlocutors come up more than once, those who had, experiences that were really emblematic. And so, yeah, I don't know exactly how many
Mm.
voices were centered, but I really did try to maintain that diversity of representation, because all too often Muslims and are reduced, right, to a sort of a monolith, and we don't get to see the diversity of experiences.
From the range of interviews that you have done, what stood out in terms like a story, a narrative, an experience that really got you just to step back and say, did I really hear this coming from this person? If you could share with us from
Sure. I mean, I
your.
think one of the things, and I use this example a lot because I think it was what really kind of struck me as an aha moment as I was talking to youth, and I would ask them, you know, most of the youth I talked to, because they are millennial generation, were not like, they were born just a bit before 9/11 happened. So they were maybe, in elementary school at that time. They didn't know necessarily a lot about the world prior. And so when I'd ask them, so how do you think that this affected you, as you're growing up and coming of age? And a lot of the times they tell me, no, 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 it really didn't affect me. And I would be surprised by that response. But then I would ask them questions about, okay, so you're in a Muslim student association. What is your group doing? And they'd say, well, we would want to go and play paintball up north, but we didn't want to be seen as a terrorist cell.
Mm.
And then I would think, oh, okay, yeah, but 9/11 didn't affect you, right? Or, they would say, well, we don't play violent video games anymore in the concourse of the university. We don't want people to see us and think that
Mm.
we are violent or that we're plotting an attack. Oh, okay, but then 9/11 didn't affect you, So there was a lot of that where I think that they became very self-surveilling, but it registered more as just the new normal. That was something that they
Mm.
were socialized into and didn't realize, or necessarily always trace it back to that sort of catalytic moment.
Mm.
But this was how they navigated the world, that they had to think twice. Like, I remember one scenario where one woman was talking about, or one of the youth was talking about going on an airplane with her baby cousin, and they had a book that was about how to fly an airplane. And then they sort of realized, like, oh my gosh, why are we bringing this on an airplane? Like, people are going to be, thinking, what are they doing? Are they going to hijack the plane? They're teaching their kids to hijack a plane. And so just things like that, where you have to second guess doing something that, is just very innocent or very casual, and having to be aware of how those innocent actions are going to register and resonate differently because of the kind of Islamophobic climate and culture that we live in. And I think that was very distinct from, I talk about in the preface of the book my own experience in university, being part of the MSA. And we did a lot of things that we didn't have to second guess in quite the same way. Things that we did in my day would now maybe be seen as suspect. But we didn't think about it quite the same, some 30 years ago.
Was there any distinction in terms of responses from women versus men in the response relative to the experiences? Did we see that? Also, maybe observing religious garb, whether the hijab or so on, the beard. Did any of that come out in your interviews?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for sure, the way gender registers within Islamophobia is, always very distinct. The sort of gendered Islamophobia that, the women talked about, really what had to do with how their particular identities were read by others. One talked about if she's driving a car and she's not driving, she's driving fast or whatever, she has to realize that, oh, it's not me driving like a maniac. It's a hijabi driving like a maniac. And therefore, people will not just judge her, but judge, the entire, population of Muslims globally based on that. So this sense of not being seen as an individual, but being always seen as part of a collective, particularly if you're visually marked as a Muslim, like if you are wearing hijab, or, if you're a male and you're wearing a beard. Some talked about relatives who would shave whenever they crossed the border because they didn't want to be stopped. They didn't want to be harassed. So that sort of selective distancing from identity in order simply to, not be marked, not be pulled aside at the border, and have to face interrogation or things like that was also something that was evident in the narratives.
I know in the chapter 2 you talk about identity, citizenship, and belonging in the age of Islamophobia. How did the respondents identify themselves in terms of their identity? Muslim, Muslim Canadian, Canadian, Canadian Muslim. Did any of that comes out? And then how do they relate to citizenship? Again, Canada, citizenship is a curious thing for communities of color,
Yeah.
and they're still trying to remedy the long history of otherization. So how your interlocutors in this conversation dealt with, again, the identity, the citizenship, the sense of belonging, and
Mhm.
is there any change?
Well, I think it was important that, all of the youth I talked to did not see their identity as Muslims and their identity as Canadians as being any way, contradictory. They definitely felt they were Canadian. They definitely, identified as being Muslim. And these were both important parts of their identity that they didn't necessarily see a conflict with. However, they were aware that others, didn't necessarily see them as being part of the nation. So I think that was sort of what they had to grapple with more, was how others positioned and located them as not being part of the nation, as being, potential threats to the nation, in fact. And so I think, citizenship has always been a precarious type of identification when it comes to racialized and marginalized groups, it's often very contingent upon how you're behaving. And so, and how your behaviors, attitudes, your associations are read by others. And so I think that there was often a lot of this sort of good Muslim, bad Muslim type of archetypes that they felt that they had to adhere to, a certain way of being within the world, so that they were not seen as potential threats. So they talked about, smiling more in public, giving up their seat to somebody on the bus, and just, being more approachable, so that they would not be seen as the stereotype. And so that definitely affected, the way that they reside within the nation and the way that they understand others to be seeing them as, part of society. So they were very strong in their sense of identity, but they were also aware that others wanted to, did not want to see them necessarily as part of the Canadian fabric, if you will. So that even though they're born in Canada or, are citizens, that citizenship was always something that was precarious and contingent and wasn't a guarantee of belonging.
Now, both of us work on campus, both with Muslim students in general.
Yeah.
How were their responses in general to the campus, but more importantly, the campus climate, which people think that the campus is this liberal bastion relative to issues of inclusion and so on. So how did the responses, but also your engagement with them on the campus issues?
Yeah, I have a chapter that looks at campus culture in an age of empire. And that chapter is probably the one that looks most sort of internally at the issues between Muslim students and Muslim groups, as opposed to necessarily just being sort of outward looking in terms of their engagement with broader society, although that is part of it. But, it did focus on Muslim student associations, what their role was within campus culture, and how they are kind of creating, kind of a Muslim subculture on campus, as well as being a Muslim counterpublic, in the sense that they were able to, on the one hand, have this subculture where, they could get together and they could have prayers, they could have Islamic events, they could do social things among other Muslims and create community and camaraderie and solidarity and so on. And at the same time, they could also use their positionality and the campus space to, educate others on campus about who they were, whether it was through kind of Islamic awareness weeks and things like that, or to partner with other kinds of marginalized groups on common platforms. But it was a way also for them to speak back to the kinds of oppression they were facing, and use that Muslim counter-public space as a way to engage and challenge their marginality. So I think, it was really good to see the way that they were taking up that space, both as a way to create that Islamic subculture and as a way to engage with the broader community and other groups and or associations as well. So, they did a lot of work for Muslims abroad as well, fundraising, doing solidarity work on Palestine, for example, raising money for various causes. And so that was something that kind of political literacy was also building, among the youth there. So I think that, the Muslim student associations were kind of central to that space on campus where these youth could go to and get, support and solidarity, as well as, religious knowledge and education.
Now, this is a conversation in general that to have about the Muslim students, but also the Muslim community, is this engagement of the interfaith component, which was often to display how good Muslims are and not to actually offer a strong critique, both of the society they're in, but also the foreign policy. Did that come out at any of the conversation of wanting to put the good face of Muslims and Islam and engaging in a conversation where it's, it's almost that you're censoring yourself in order for you to appeal to the broader society, and also possibly some of the pressure of Muslims from major Muslim institutions that likewise want to maintain that boundary or constructed around the youth. Did any of your engagement and interviews glean that material out?
I think, there was a lot of, issues around sectarian differences within, and, the Muslim student associations tend to, in a lot of ways, be fairly Sunni dominated. So in the intra group, there was some tensions there. As far as building networks with other sort of faith communities, I don't think that there was too much emphasis on that within campus. I think that they were, however, in sort of performing the good Muslim role, right? Trying to put, not wanting to be seen as troublemakers or, too politicized, because, well, what if you are seen therefore as, having loyalties outside of Canada or things that would make you suspect? Because in fact, a lot of these youth organizations, the MSAs, were under surveillance by security agencies, right? I've sat in on a few of these meetings, where they come to campus and want to talk to Muslim student associations, and see them as potential breeding grounds for radicalization and so on. And so when you are, subject to that surveillance, then you are a lot more, again, self-surveilling and self-censoring as well, because you don't want to play into that. You know that people have already put you in this box, so you don't want to play into that particular trope. And so that does create a sense of censorship and a sense of, being mindful of how you carry yourself, what you say, what you causes you align yourself with, and so on. I remember one participant saying, that that was sometimes, a disincentive for getting involved in the MSA, because they didn't want to be marked or labeled, as part of a group that would be considered suspect.
Well, I remember actually some parents, as they were coming to take their kids to Berkeley and so on as freshmen, actually telling their kids not to engage in the MSA,
Exactly.
telling their kids not to engage in the Students for Justice in Palestine.
Yeah.
You're just there to study. So did you have similar type of comments coming out?
Yes. I heard from MSA presidents that sometimes that was part of the difficulty that they had, where parents were concerned, for their kids getting involved with the MSA, because they thought that might, divert them from other things that they're doing, or that they would be seen as suspect and so on. And so that, sense of fear and looking over your shoulder, that is part of how this 9/11 generation has been socialized and grown up, carries into their university experiences, their social engagement with other Muslims, just congregating as a group of Muslims, right? Can make them suspect.
Yeah. Now, both the chapter on the security industrial complex, and also maybe you could speak about the mapping of the whole Islamophobia industry, that maybe is a build-up on that, and how the Muslim as a boogeyman. I always say that being a Muslim is a stimulus to the economy, because you have this whole Islamophobic industry, all of the security infrastructure, and creating the Muslim as a boogeyman. So how is that, at least how your youth that you interviewed, how did they respond? What kind of interaction and view they have of being a boogeyman, and then the industrial complex that is just focusing on them?
Yeah, and this was something I encountered, as I mentioned, firsthand, because, some of these youth, for example, my son, my younger son, when he was elected president of the Muslim Student Association at his university, and the very next day he gets a phone call from CSIS, which is Canada's sort of spy agency, on his cell phone, wanting to talk to him, because he'd just been elected. Now, how did they know that he was elected as the president, and why were they calling him the very next morning? So that sense of securitization and sort of racial securitization followed them through their university experiences, whether or when they were crossing the borders, or when they're opening bank accounts, or whatever they're doing, their name, how they dress, their identity was always something that was, rendered them suspect. They became this sort of new folk devil that had the attention of security agencies. So, there was a lot of rhetoric in Canada and of course globally about the, Muslim youth as the potential radical, the jihadist, and so on. And so security agencies were focusing their attention on Muslim youth quite heavily since 9/11. And of course, as a result of that, they were sleeping at the wheel when it came to the far right, when it came to white nationalists. And so while Muslim youth were considered the primary threat to Canadian national security, we have now had two major terror attacks in Canada at the hands of white nationalists, both on January 29th, 2017 in Quebec at a mosque, and then just last year in London, Ontario, where a Canadian Muslim family were mowed down by a truck that killed 4 members of that family. And, right after that incident happened at the hands of a white nationalist, I have this image that came from one of these, Terrorgram websites of the family, and their pictures that were, in the newspaper and everywhere, but they had a caption across it that said "Dead Invaders." And that was really horrifying to see, but it is part of the sort of narratives about Muslims that, I've tried to talk about and capture in this report that I did on the Canadian Islamophobia industry. And one of those being that Muslims are invaders, that they are, the boogeyman, they are the Islamist boogeyman. They are using deception or taqiyya as a means of coming into Western nations and taking over and then installing Sharia law, this sort of grand conspiracy theories that are being, purveyed globally. But also here in Canada, we found some very, very troubling ideas. And so, of course, a lot of the, why we think of those as being part of what's circulating in far right echo chambers, those ideas have also become mainstream, and they've certainly been notions upon which security policies have been predicated, and racial profiling, activities against Muslims. We're also seeing surveillance of Muslim charities, by Canada Revenue Agency. So there's a number of ways that security, industrial complex is broadening its scope and focusing on Muslim communities with a kind of singular focus over, the last couple of decades. But what we're seeing are the bigger threats that are coming from far right white nationalists, and that has reached deadly proportions in Canada. So, one of the things in, my report on the Islamophobia industry that we were able to do is to bring in other players that hadn't originally been linked to these industries. So, for example, security think tanks and self-styled security experts. They come in and, have their own, they bring in their sort of pseudo expertise and lend a certain validation and credibility to those narratives of Muslim jihadists, terrorists, the kind of fifth column and enemies within who are just waiting and, to plan an attack and take over. So that kind of moral panic is very much validated by these security agencies and the kinds of discourse and rhetoric that they base their practices upon. And so that was something that, we connected as being part of this broader Islamophobic ecosystem, in Canada. And so that was, I think where the securitization element of that industry also connects to that broader Islamophobia network that has many different, players that are connected and that are orchestrating controversies about Muslims, are creating propaganda, and are mounting multiple types of campaigns to demonize and vilify Muslims.
Just for people, the report that Jasmin has really done a monumental work on is the Canadian Islamophobia industry, mapping Islamophobia's ecosystem in the Great White North. You could find it at Islamophobia Studies Center website, as well as in the Center for Race and Gender website at UC Berkeley. It's really an important work that needs to be shared, needs to be amplified, just to understand the scope of Islamophobia. uh, when we think about Islamophobia, often people think it's just like maybe somebody pulling a headscarf, and those are individual acts which take place. But what we need is the infrastructure and the various actors, the think tanks, the media pundits, the individuals that are, again, I don't want to call them experts, but wannabe experts, but they are brought in. All this, that's a full industry that almost 24/7 with massive, massive, massive resources at their disposal, both here in Canada, but also in the United States and other places. So really, thank you for the report. It's a monumental work. And just to understand what we are facing, and how the youth, those who grew up during this past 20 years, how they are affected every time that you turn the TV. I say in a slow day, there's about 10 stories, negative stories about Muslims. On a busy day, the whole media and the whole stories is about us and covers the full spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's important to get a sense of the complexity of Islamophobia, right? In terms of how it's organized. And I think that's what's really distinctive about Islamophobia as a system of oppression. And in my book and in the report, I talk about it as a system of oppression. And unlike others, it has this industry behind its promotion that is 24/7 working to, create propaganda, disinformation, mount political campaigns, and to demonize and vilify Muslims. And so it's kind of unprecedented, really, when you think about that, and how that is very unique to Islamophobia, and the massive amounts, staggering amounts of money that's behind it, particularly in the United States. And some of that does filter into Canada. So these networks are becoming global and integrated, and they, of course, are impacting, the lives of Muslims who, whether it's through experiencing microaggressions, as you're going to work or school, or whether it's being profiled at borders, or whether it's not getting jobs, or not being able to access safe and affordable housing. There isn't an aspect of life that isn't impacted, by Islamophobia. So understanding these networks is very, very important. One of the things that we were able to bring into that particular study that the others did not include was also the far right and white nationalist groups. And, in Canada, we've got about 300 far right white nationalist groups of different stripes and different sizes and so on. And so, tying that back to the discussion on security and securitization, white nationalist radicalization was not what security agencies were focusing on. And, that has now become also a global kind of movement that needs to be taken seriously. And I think now there is more emphasis on looking at that as well. So that was something that we also attached to this study of, Islamophobia networks, is to look at how the security think tanks, as well as far right white nationalist groups, were connected to that.
Now, I know in the last chapter you speak about Muslim counter publics, the art, and anti-colonial public pedagogy. And I know that you've been engaged in the arts for quite a long time. So that's right in your wheelbox for quite some time. So how did that narrative relative to the youth of the age of Islamophobia, how did they do this counter publics? What was their engagement? How did they come up into engaging the art and shifting the conversation, which is ongoing, and also having the anti-colonial lens?
Yeah, I really didn't want to end this book by leaving an impression that Muslim youth were just sort of passive victims of circumstance, or of being born at a particular time where, the kinds of conditions they were being socialized into led them into all of these very fraught conditions that affected their identities and so on. Certainly all of that happened, but they were never passive within that. And so I really wanted to talk about resistance. And it's been the theme of resistance is something that I include in all of my work, because we need to talk about how do we begin to challenge and resist all of these multiple interlocking forms of oppression. And so I was inspired by the youth that I talked to that were engaging the arts in particular as a way of, resisting their marginality, of finding a voice, of claiming a space to tell counter stories. So I talk about, the counter story, and that comes from, looking at critical race theory and pedagogy, the idea of critical race counter stories, where, you're kind of reclaiming the stage and taking back the mic and trying to, present your own truths, right? Not the Orientalist ideas that have been imprinted in media and popular culture and television and film for centuries. Not the negative representation that you see on Fox News, CNN, and all of these other types of outlets, or places like Rebel Media in Canada, but to really begin to find a space to articulate their own sense of who they are, not just as an image corrective. A lot of youth talk about having to correct that image, and they felt that burden of responsibility that they had to be that image corrective, but really just to be authentic about telling a different story of the Muslim experience. And that in and of itself became a political act. It became an act, an anti-colonial act, because it was dismantling those, tired, cliched colonial tropes that continue to shape the way that Muslims are seen and perceived. So in and of itself, it's an anti-colonial act. And it's a kind of public pedagogy because it is educative. And so, that's how I, tried to frame it. And so I talked to Muslim youth artists that were doing things like spoken word poetry, that were doing theater, comedy, and the different ways in which they use those artistic platforms to talk about their experiences, and to kind of be resistant and have more resistant narratives. And so I thought that was where I really saw the hope as well for the future, in terms of being able to change the narrative. I think we have to have that space for cultural production, for the storytellers, for the artists, because they impact us in ways that stick with you, in a very visceral way, in a very emotional way, versus, just sort of reading something or hearing it, when you see it represented, when you see people very passionately expressing themselves. And, we're starting to see that, not just within the youth circles that I looked at, but also we're starting to see it in other, programming now, in films, television shows like Rami, for example, where you're starting to see, more complex Muslim identities featured, taking on political issues that no one would have touched in the past. So that kind of, I think, courage and risk-taking is something that artists are able to do in very impactful ways, and in ways that move people and actually reach broader publics. This isn't just for Muslims, right? What they're creating is for the broader, multiple overlapping publics. And I think that's, important. So I wanted to really end with looking at that kind of resistance and seeing what, the youth were engaging in as a kind of political act and public pedagogy.
Well, I'm connecting this to the beginning of our conversation, because I was visiting Toronto when Yusuf had his premiere of the documentary on the Rohingya.
Yes.
And his play. So your own son was part not only of the generation, but also engaged in media production on such an important topic, which is, the genocide in Myanmar. So maybe you could touch on that connection of almost coming from the beginning of the book to the conclusion as well.
You're right, actually. And, my son Yusuf was actually he was a participant in this study as well. And so I did include him among the Muslim artists, because he was doing some work that I felt, did represent.
Edge, just like Hatem, where nobody wanted to touch the case in general.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and he was engaging with other youth in, the area of Ontario that his university was in, who were Rohingya refugees. And they said, like, we want to tell our stories. We want people to know what's going on in our homeland, what we suffered, what our families suffered, our parents, and so on. And, from living within this context of genocide, and then being forced into the sea in boats, going to Bangladesh and being in refugee camps, and then finally making their way to Canada. And having all of that, rupture and disruption and dislocation and, the refugee experience. And they wanted to tell that story. And these were kids from the ages of 8 years old to 21, 22, 15 of them. And so, my son worked with them because he is an actor and was in theater as well, and was able to work with them to co-write an ethnographic play of 4 acts. It was called I Am Rohingya, Genocide in 4 Acts. And, also trained these youth to be actors. And they were telling stories that were theirs, but also their family stories and struggles. And so it was very powerful and moving to watch them transform, throughout this documentary, and to see that the play that they co-created come to life, that told that very difficult story of violence, of genocide, of, that, but also of that resilience, right, of what it meant for them to be able to then come here and claim a voice. And so it was very, very inspiring to see that, and to see where the important political work that this documentary did. It went around the world, it was shown in Parliament, and it was, catapulted the youth that were involved in it to another level, where they became leaders of their communities, and so, and that's the power of the arts. So that was one of the examples that I gave in the book, and through interviews with Yusuf. I also interviewed, a Muslim Canadian Palestinian theater artist. She was a comedian. And she went to the UK to be part of a theater program. And, there were actually a lot of Israelis in this program. And, they sort of politically started butting heads for a long time. And, to the point where they were arguing in a restaurant and caused a scene. And then they all just started laughing and thought, what are we doing? Like, why don't we try and do something with theater, with comedy, to try and, unpack the tensions and situation that, we're dealing with as Palestinians, as Israelis, because everybody wants to, actually work towards some form of peace. So let's see what we can do in that. So they decided to form a conflict relief theater company. And not only would they do skits through comedy to try and tackle some of these very difficult issues, they would then go out in the audience after and debrief with people so that they could talk about it. They could, try and understand the issues. And they were trying to understand each other too through the process, right? And it was very fraught. So, that was another example in that final chapter of looking at the different kinds of interventions and different kinds of global political challenges that youth in Canada were trying to grapple with, because they are transnational actors. They've all got connections abroad. They're watching and seeing what's going on in the Muslim world globally, and want to be able to intervene in that in a positive way.
What's your next project?
Oh, I don't even know at this point. I just having had this report out, as well as the book kind of back to back, has been a lot of work. And we do have that special issue of Islamophobia in Canada coming out in the Islamophobia Studies Journal.
In a couple of weeks.
In a couple of weeks. So that's been, quite a lot. So I think at this point, I'm just trying to take stock and seeing what I want to focus on next. But I haven't made any, decisions. But I think, there's always so much to do in this field of Islamophobia studies. I think I do want to look a little bit outside of Canada now and look a bit more globally. I think I've been inspired by different things I have been learning through this process. And we're looking at in Canada, whether it's Muslim youth, whether it's the Islamophobia industry, these are all reflected, globally as well. This isn't just something that is happening in Canada. There are refractions and reflections of this in different parts of the world. Islamophobia is a global phenomenon.
Sure, with the Hindutva in India, You have definitely you highlighted the Zionist engagement within the Islamophobia industry, the white nationalists. So the mapping to understand the various actors that are playing. So really the transnational component of it and the different settings, it's a must.
Yeah, I think, if someone was to replicate these kinds of studies elsewhere, they would find very similar kinds of trends, players and so on. So I think that, we have to, I want to at least move on from just a national focus to more of a global purview, to look at dimensions of Islamophobia more globally and try and understand those in a particular way. So I think that's really where I want to head next. And yeah, but I think first I want to take a bit of a break.
Great. So, thank you, Jasmine, for being with us. Again, the book is Under Siege, Jasmin Zine. Please make sure to pick it up. If you're teaching a course, whether it's on Islam in America or Islam in Europe, Islam in Canada, or Islam in the West in general, there's definitely a few chapters, if not the whole book, that you could actually incorporate into your reading list. Share it on your social media. These are important works. It takes considerable effort to really put together a book, and we don't have a massive industry behind our undoing and challenging Islamophobia. So each one of these books and materials that produce is literally a work of love countering Islamophobia, as well as really sharing the Canadian Islamophobia industry report. So really thank you, Jasmine, for being with us. You enriched us with your contribution, with your conversation. Wish you all the best and give greetings to both Usama and Yusuf. And hopefully next time we'll see them in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.